Hello and welcome. I am so happy that you have joined me here today. Today we are looking at the very last chapter of Nehemiah, so grab yourself a cuppa and we'll get started. So we're finally at the end of Nehemiah, but we're going to have a little bit of a look at the time between the previous chapter, so chapter 12, and this chapter. It gives us a little bit of insight as we go into our last chapter of Nehemiah. So after completing his first term as governor of Judah, Nehemiah returned to Babylon to fulfill his previous duties to the Persian court. So we remember that he was a cupbearer to the king. So for an unknown period of time this happens. We can see this in Nehemiah 13 verse 6. So the commentators have varied opinions on how long he remained away from Jerusalem. Some say it was 2 years, others say it was as much as 12 years. So Nehemiah left sometime after that remarkable spiritual revival noted in the previous chapters. But when he came back to Jerusalem for the second time, he discovered that the people had strayed from the covenant that they had signed. And to get them back on track with God, God's word was read to the people again. And sadly, this reversion is nothing really new. They had also reverted after Ezra's repentance some 20 years earlier, and it's also experienced in the New Testament as well by Paul, and it's sadly experienced still today where people are on fire for God and then they revert back to not following him. Paul mentions in Galatians 1 verses 6 to 7, I am astonished that you so quickly are deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. So, yeah, we don't just see it in Nehemiah, we see it in the New Testament, and sadly we see it still today. So, but the real test of revival, the real test that God is at work in people's life is in the long run. It's seeing where the Lord's people are in 10 years' time, in a different season, after the hype and the emotion of spiritual revival. So let's get into Nehemiah 13, verse 1. On that day, the book of Moses was read out loud in the hearing of the people, and there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite would ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met with the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Our God, however, turned that curse into a blessing. So as the people drew near to God in worship, as seen in Nehemiah 11 and Nehemiah 12, they became aware of God's standards. And in this case, the standard was stated in Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 to 4, where the Ammonites and the Moabites were not regarded to be part of the people of Israel. So we can see that in Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 to 4. It says, no Ammonite or Moabite or any other descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even the 10th generation. For they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt, and they hired Balaam the son of Beor to pronounce a curse on you. So long before, the Ammonites and the Moabites had schemed against Israel, and God had made a point and a promise to the father of the Jewish people, Abraham. He said, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. It's in Genesis 12, verse 3. So an Israelite was part of God's covenant by birth, but an Ammonite or a Moabite wasn't, because they had not met with the children of Israel to bring them bread and water. The Ammonites and the Moabites were singled out because of their devious schemes against Israel, and when Israel came into the promised land at least 1,000 years before. However, our God turned it into a blessing, says Nehemiah 13, the second half of verse 2. And this may refer to the events where God had blessed Israel, even though the prophet Balaam wanted to curse them, as ordered by Balak, king of the Moabites. And it reminds us that God is able, he's more than able to turn any curse into a blessing. It says, when the people heard the law, they excluded from Israel all those of foreign descent. So then they enacted the law. Verse 4, before this, Eliashib, the priest, had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of God. He was closely associated with Tobiah, and he had provided him with large rooms formerly used to store the grain and the offering and the incense and the temple articles, and also the tithe of grain, new wine and the olives, olive oil prescribed for the Levites, musicians, gatekeepers, as well as the contributions to the priests. So Eliashib, the priest, he had entered into agreement with one of the enemies of Nehemiah's work in rebuilding the wall. And this man was called Tobiah. You may remember him from chapters 2, 4, and 6. Nehemiah was an Ammonite, and he was a major adversary to Nehemiah. He was working with Sanballat the Horonite and Gershom the Arab, and they tried so hard to hinder the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. His actions involved constant mockery and intimidation and conspiracies, and now he's infiltrating the Jewish community. And incidentally, Tobiah was an Ammonite. We can see that into verse 10, and one of the very mixed multitude that had been put out of the assembly of God some 2 or maybe 12 years before, depending on how you read that time period. And at this point of the record, Nehemiah, Tobiah was not only present among the people, but he was actually living in the temple. It's astonishing to see he had weaseled his way that deeply into Israel. Verse 6, but while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, and for the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Sometime later, I had asked permission to come back to Jerusalem. So this is where it is assumed that he was not present for those somewhere between 2 and 12 years. Here I learned about the evil thing that Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of the Lord. I was greatly displeased, and threw Tobiah's household and goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put it back to them, the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense. So this action of Tobiah, it grieved, or not just the action of Tobiah, it was the action of the people of Eliashib that let him stay. It grieved Nehemiah so deeply. He was bitter about it. He was greatly displeased. And there were many reasons why it could have been so distressing to Nehemiah. Maybe it grieved him because the rooms of the court of the temple were being occupied by a man who had a history of actively opposing God's work in the days of Nehemiah. Maybe it grieved him because it reflected so badly on Eliashib, a man who was the spiritual leader of Israel and those around him. It showed that Eliashib was maybe spiritually blind, maybe even corrupt. It grieved Nehemiah maybe because Nehemiah had questioned the lasting value of that spiritual revival that he had witnessed in Jerusalem years before. He worried that maybe the revival wasn't genuine, maybe. Nehemiah threw the household goods of Tobiah out of the room. Nehemiah wasn't one just to sit there and grieve. He took some serious action. He threw all of his goods out, and then they reoccupied the temple rooms in how it was supposed to be used. He cleaned the rooms and he put the rooms back to proper use and put the sacred things back into the temple. And Nehemiah, in a way, he was much like Jesus, who later cleansed the temple from those who profaned it. And so both Jesus and Nehemiah had the wisdom not to confuse love with being nice. They both had wisdom to know when to take bold action and clear the temple of those that dishonoured God. And Eliashib was finally expelled later in this chapter in verse 28. Nehemiah then finds something else that the Israelites have failed and neglected to do. In verse 10, I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and all the Levites and the musicians responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. So I rebuked the officials and asked them, why is the house of God neglected? And then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. So the people of God did not obey God's word regarding giving and regarding being generous. So back in Nehemiah 10 verses 39b, the people promised, we will not neglect the temple of God. But they eventually did. And as a result of the lack of support, those who would be giving their time in service for God and his people, so these are the Levites and the singers, they were not supported and they couldn't continue serving because they needed resources to live, really. And they had to leave that service of being a priest and a singer, and they had to go back to their fields to earn a living. And the lack of giving and support of the Levites was a way of forsaking the house of God. And it wasn't just unhelpful to the Levites and the singers, it really was evidence that the people were turning their backs on God. Verse 12, all Judah brought their tithes and grain and new wine and olive oil to the storerooms. I put Shalima, the priest, and Zadok the scribe, and a Levite named Partow in charge of the storerooms, and made Hanan, the son of Zachor, the son of Matthiah, their assistants, because they were considered trustworthy. And they were made responsible for distributing the supplies to the Levites. And so Nehemiah had discovered that the Levites had gone back to their farms, and now he's gathered them back, and he has put some people in charge that are considered trustworthy. And then we find that Nehemiah prays. We know that he is a man of prayer. Verse 14, remember me for this, O God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. So Nehemiah pleads with God to remember his faithful actions regarding the restoration of the temple services and the proper tithing of the Levites and the upholding of the Sabbath, and asking that his efforts not be ignored. And this is a desperate and humble prayer for God's favour and recognition for his diligent sacrificial services, rather than being like a self-righteous prayer. Verse 15, in those days I saw the people of Judah treading the winepress on the Sabbath, bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, and together with the wine and the grapes, the figs, and all other kinds of loads. They were bringing all into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore I warned them against selling food on that day. So Nehemiah, he saw that the people of Judah, they were treading the winepress on the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was being ignored in disobedience to God's clear command under the Old Covenant. And on the Sabbath, when they were supposed to be resting and trusting God, people were selling goods, and people were bringing goods into Jerusalem. But also, foreigners were also selling their goods to the Israelites on the Sabbath. We see this in verse 16. So people from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. And I rebuked the nobles of Judah, and I said to them, what is this wicked thing that you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your ancestors do the same things, that God brought them all this calamity on us and on this city? Why are you stirring up the wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath? So why was it so important to keep the Sabbath sacred? And at the root of this problem is misplaced priorities. It's not necessarily the day of the week. It's really more about displaced priorities. There's nothing wrong with buying or selling, only that when the desire to buy or sell and to make money and to spend money becomes more important than honouring God. And this was a clear way that the people were making and spending money before they were choosing to glorify God. And so Nehemiah took action to encourage the people to keep the Sabbath of God. So verse 19, when the evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not open until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load would be brought in on the Sabbath day. Once or twice the merchants and the sellers and all kinds of goods were spent the night outside Jerusalem. But I warned them and said, why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will arrest you. And from that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. And when I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. So Nehemiah, he took decisive action to ensure that the Sabbath was kept for God by physically preventing the commerce and enforcing holiness on that day. So he ordered the gates to be closed, he stationed a private security, he prevented outside training, and he appointed the Levites as guard, and then he actually confronted the leadership. And now again, Nehemiah prays. He says, remember me for this also, my God, and show mercy on me according to your great love. So he asks God to recognize his efforts and restore holiness, seeking divine favour and compassion based on God's steadfast and unchanging and great love. Verse 23, moreover, in those days I saw the men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of the children spoke the language of Ashdod and the language of one of the peoples, and I did not know how to speak and they did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them and called curses down on them, and I beat the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourself. So Nehemiah, he had observed that the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And in the years Nehemiah was away from the Israelites, when he was back being cupbearer of the king. And so there was a lot of practice. While he was away, there was a practice of intermarrying with these pagan nations that were surrounding them. Even though they had promised not to in Nehemiah chapter 10, verses 30 to 39. So this was dramatic disobedience to God's command. They had already promised not to intermarry and vowed to keep God's commandments. We can see that in Ezra 10 and Nehemiah 10. From the strong reaction of Nehemiah, we gather that he considered it to be the most dangerous of all sins, pursuing ungodly romance and getting involved in romantic relationships that God has consistently said no to. Nehemiah is so righteously frustrated with the people of Israel for reneging on their covenant and forgetting that their Lord, but he actually went to the extent he beat some of the men and he pulled out their hair. Verse 26, was it not because of the marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, had sinned? Among many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by God, and God made him king over all of Israel. But even he was led into the sin by foreign women. We must hear now that you are, must we hear now that you too are doing this terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to God by marrying foreign women? So Nehemiah uses the example of King Solomon, and this would be well remembered in the memory of the Israelites at the time. Basically, he's saying if King Solomon, who was one of the wisest and most blessed men, he was king, if he sinned with the unwise and ungodly marriages, then no one else should consider themselves immune to such temptation. And Nehemiah reminds them that this is the reason why Jerusalem fell in the first place, was Israel's unfaithfulness to God and his law. Verse 28, one of the sons of Jediah, son of Eliashib, the high priest, and the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite, and I drove him away from me. So Sanballat the Horonite was one of the primary adversaries who sought to stop Nehemiah from rebuilding Jerusalem's walls. And Sanballat, he sought to demoralize the workers and intimidate Nehemiah into abandoning the project. And now we see that he too, just like Tobiah, he's come back and he's weaseled his way into infiltrating the Israelite leadership by marrying off one of his daughters to one of the sons of the high priest. So this man, like Tobiah, he is a piece of work, and so Nehemiah also drove him away. And Nehemiah prays about it. Verse 29, remember them, my God, because they have defiled the priestly office, and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. So Nehemiah is asking for divine judgment against the leaders who corrupted the religious office by violating their covenant and marrying the foreign women. Verse 30, so I purified the priests and the Levites and everything foreign, and assigned them duties, each to their own task. I also made provisions and contributions of wood at the designated times of the first fruits. Remember me with favour, my God. So Nehemiah restores everything back to what it should be, and he purifies the priesthood. And then the last line in this whole book, Nehemiah prays, because he is a man of prayer. And we need to learn that lesson too, don't we? And so that at the end of it all, Nehemiah did his best to make the people of God strong and safe and secure and spiritually honouring their God. But beyond that, he also led the people into pure and worshipful obedience to him. And it is good to just sort of follow his example of praying at every turn and giving his plans to God. So that's all I have for you from the whole book of Nehemiah. I hope that you have enjoyed this as much as I have, and I will see you next time. Bye.